Good afternoon, listeners. Welcome back to another exciting episode of Cambrian Explosion with your hosts, Nabil, the man with the news, and your host, Yawer, just reacting to, trying to keep up with everything that Nabil is saying. So, we've got an exciting discussion, hopefully, coming up for you. We've been talking about this a lot among ourselves, and Nabil, I think you have a lot of things to say about this topic, right?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about de-dollarization and what's happening on that side. And I'm going to be presenting a bit, and then Yawer is going to be picking apart my presentation as
Well,
we go.
trying to, but I don't think I'll have much success because Nabil makes some very convincing arguments. So let's see.
So one of the things that if you look up on Google Trends, or if you look online, you will start seeing that de-dollarization is has steadily been picking up mentions across the last 2 odd years, and we just wanted to talk about it and cover what it is. So let's start off with what is dollarization. Globally, the trade that happens tends to happen with the dollar. It has become the standard currency of trade, which means that almost all countries keep a certain amount of dollars as part of their treasury because they need those dollars to be able to trade quickly and efficiently without having to get into what are exchange rates, etc., etc.
Okay, and when did this start happening?
So this is after World War II. There was a time, I forget the exact date, when the major Western economies came together.
Was it the Bretton Woods Agreement?
Yes, the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Okay.
And the major economies came together, and they decided that this would be the way to approach approach it.
Okay, so Bretton Woods Agreement, just post World War II, Reconstruction, the U.S. and allies come together and they decide to set up a new world order.
Hmm.
And part of the new world order is that the currency for settlements of international trade is going to be the U.S. dollar. Also, you've called it, Nabil, I think, from time to time, you call it the petrodollar
Yeah,
because.
the petrodollar is something slightly that happened slightly afterwards, which is that during the 1970s there is the Saudi oil crisis, that the oil crisis that happens, and part of the oil crisis as part of the oil crisis, a deal is reached between the Americans and the Saudis and the Arabs to peg kind of peg the dollar and the it's a de facto peg between the dollar and the petrol. Before that, gold used to be the standard. Then gold became free. Then the dollar became free floating from gold, and then this happens. It de facto happens. Um, Oil, petroleum products are one of the largest, if not the largest, traded commodity in the market.
Yeah, it's the basis of global civilization today, right? Fossil fuels.
Exactly, and with that de facto pegging happening between the dollar and oil, it essentially meant that even if you didn't want to be part of this system, if you wanted to trade oil, you had to go with a dollar currency. So almost it kind of forced almost all
So the
countries into
US
it.
dollar has a de facto hegemony, which gave the United States uh, vast powers over the global political and economic landscape because they can effectively cut out countries from participation in the global trade
Yes,
by sanctioning them.
yes, that's one of the effects of it. The other effect of it is that it also gives a lot of depth to the US economy, because essentially they can draw unlimited amount of loans against it, because um, the dollar will always be worth some petrol.
So the
So
US dollar is backed by global fossil fuel trade. So you're saying that effectively the dollar is a currency that cannot fail.
yes, It's effectively, and so when you see, oh, there's like $3 trillion and they're going to raise the ceiling in Congress, they can raise the ceiling because the dollar is backed by the
I feel like though the U.S. debt ceiling is something else. It's a kind of an anachronistic like a limit that they set on themselves, but it doesn't really mean anything. No other country in the world has a debt ceiling like the U.S. And I think one country, I think I heard that one country, Australia, used to, but they got rid of it when they realized that it doesn't actually mean it.
that's for most other countries. If they have too much debt, they have to declare bankruptcy. The US doesn't. The US has had so much debt. Where is its bankruptcy? Why is
No,
it
but I
not?
feel like the debt ceiling. I've heard this from economists. The debt ceiling is not actually saying that okay, we are going to take on more debt. The debt ceiling is saying that we are going to raise the ceiling on how much of the debt we will repay. We've already taken on the debt. Now we are just going to say that yes, we are going to confirm that we're going to repay it. Because if they don't, then that says that oh, okay, we're actually going to default on the debt.
Where this? Why can't other countries do the same thing? Why
Yeah,
why
exactly.
why
And no country should, right, default on their debts because then they'll become
why
effectively a
why did
failed state, right?
wh-
And nobody in the U.S. wants that either.
why did Iceland have to go bankrupt? Iceland was a developed modern economy. Why couldn't they have done the same thing in terms of setting a debt ceiling and managing it like this? Why did they have to declare bankruptcy? And to me, the way I see it is that as long as the dollar is in circulation in global trade, there is always the opportunity that exists to repay any amount of loans. So that's why they're able to keep raising the debt ceiling and saying, "Oh, we'll be able to repay it," because the the de facto currency with is the dollar, and it's always in circulation. So that's how I see things.
Also, Nabil, you have to keep in mind that the understanding of governments and the debt that they take on, uh, that we have to be careful here because we often fool ourselves into thinking that government debt is like the debt of a household, but it's not. It's actually it works in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at heterodox economics,
Mm.
you know, you realize that the reality of the situation is that governments take on debt to build their economies and support their people, and that is actually an investment that they make in their countries,
Mm-hmm.
which pays off in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
So, really, taking on more debt is a signal to the rest of the world that you are actually going to be um, improving your economy, right, for a government.
It can be seen that way. It can also be argued the other way. I mean,
Sure,
it can be argued
it
both
can
ways.
be argued, but many people would say that the people who argue the other way don't actually understand economics.
The people who argue the other way can also say that
Yeah,
that this is not a set, and there are multiple economic theories around this.
sure, sure.
And I can just counter that by saying, hey, I took debt to go to school as a household. How is that different from that? Is to improve my economic situation, and it will create future earnings for me.
Well, this is an interesting point. The difference is that when when a government takes on debt, uh, the debt means that the money is actually going into things like retirement pension funds. And when the government reduces its debt load, that means that the money is effectively uh, draining out of retirement pension funds. So the amount of debt that a government has is counterbalanced by the amount of cash that is flowing in an economy. So debt and assets are counterbalanced against each other. Public debt is effectively equivalent to private assets. So when you said that a government should reduce its debt, you are effectively saying that it should reduce the assets and the cash that is available to the people of the country.
There's an assumption that you're making that countries don't go bankrupt. How do countries go bankrupt? How do countries end up with having to, like, this circle that you have described means that countries should never go bankrupt.
Mhm.
uh, liabilities are equal to assets. You can
Yeah.
always pay off your liabilities because you have enough assets.
Right. Well, let me ask you another question. Did Sri Lanka go bankrupt?
Did it?
Uh, I haven't heard anything about Sri Lanka going bankrupt, and we heard that they had a lot of problems with even buying fuel. People couldn't get petrol, and inflation
What
shot
what
up.
what 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 what, what ends up happening
Yeah.
with so what ends up happening is a country will declare bankruptcy,
Yeah.
and then this asset liability thing that you're talking about does get resolved. How does it get resolved? You take your assets and you sell them to private investors who might be from outside and therefore are bringing money in,
Mm.
and therefore your debt starts getting resolved. You still have to pay off that debt somehow, and what will end up happening is that the private assets that are owned by the people will get sold off to foreigners, to other entities who will not be representative of the people, or the government. This
Mhm.
is this is
I feel like for a country to go into bankruptcy, it really means something different, which is it means that uh, the belief that outside holders of the bonds issued by the government, they no longer have the belief that the country is able to hold up or repay its debts. So it's more about belief than it's about
they're not
real.
able to repay its debts.
Right.
And it goes back to, if the global currency, if the dollar is the global currency and is being in use,
Right.
then America is always able to repay its debts. Therefore, it coming back to two
Sure.
effects,
Let's come back to the main point.
two
Yeah.
effects that the dollarization has. One would be the American economy is buttressed because of this.
The U.S. economy certainly enjoys a special position in world economies.
And the other thing is that they're able to sanction countries, and if or entities, and if an entity is sanctioned and cannot use the dollar in global trade, it basically cannot do global trade. It's very difficult to do it.
Right.
Iran has often a problem doing global trade. It has to circumvent these kind of and that's also why the JCPOA, I believe that's what the spelling of it were, the Iran nuclear agreement. That's why the Iranians were so much pushing for it, because they want to be back part of the system where, at that time, wanted to be back of part of the system where they're able to trade in the dollar. And therefore that would improve their economy to quite a significant amount. Their ability to trade, it would be.
Yeah, but you can argue that the U.S. is not going around imposing sanctions willy-nilly, is it? Is like they usually have a pretty good reason to impose sanctions. Sanctions, for example, on Russian oligarchs, because Russia is waging war in Ukraine. So the U.S. is trying to restrict the amount of money that they can have to fund their war.
Sanctions under the UN Charter are an act of war. It's not that a country can just impose sanctions without due process. And America does impose nilly-willy sanctions on countries and individuals, which is an act of war as far as. But because America is so powerful and it controls the economic system, no country can do anything about it. But under international law, sanctions are an act of war. It's not that you can just impose sanctions because you think or disagree with another country. It is still considered an act of war.
Okay. Okay. Um, I need to research that, but I completely understand your point that it's a unilateral act, and the U.S. does have a history of doing unilateral acts for sure.
Yes.
We've seen this since the Iraq War, and
Since
even Afghanistan,
Vietnam War.
Vietnam, of course, many wars over the years. I'm just talking about recent history since 9/11. Okay, so then what's the alternative then to the U.S. hegemony?
What's the alternative to the US hegemony? Well, what's been happening is that there has been talk for many years about developing alternative currency systems, and some of these talks include, for example, Gaddafi from Libya tried to create one, and he was an extreme failure at doing that. There's other leaders who tried to do it because they wanted to keep in mind, Gaddafi, Libya was under sanctions of the Americans as well. So it speaks to why they would want to do it. Typically, it's the countries that were under sanctions that wanted to do it. But one of the key developments that has happened is that BRICS has taken on putting together some kind of an alternative currency and banking system to be able to do this.
And BRICS is
it's an economic union between Brazil, B for Brazil, R for Russia, I for India, C for China, S for South Africa. So those 5 countries, and those represent a huge population and economic power.
Right.
And recently, they have had a bunch of other countries added in there, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, I believe, that have joined the group. And that group wants to create an alternative to banking system and an alternative currency system to be able to compete with the dollar.
So, okay, let's before we come to BRICS, let's back up for a second and think about your point about create a group of countries banding together to create a new common currency, which they want to use for whatever purpose. So, like in recent history, of course, like 2 decades ago, we saw that the euro was created by the European Union countries. So, could we look at the euro as an attempt to do de-dollarization?
It's not really an attempt to do de-dollarization, but I will say that it is definitely a model that the BRICS countries are copying.
Okay.
So why do I say both of these things? The euro wasn't an attempt at de-dollarization as much as it was an attempt to create a united states of Europe.
Right.
A similar economic powerhouse to the American system.
Right.
And it wasn't so much about the currency, but the currency helps integrate all of the economies together. Otherwise, you still have economic mechanisms around which create a lot of tension around how do you exchange, what the exchange rate should be, how should it be dealt with. But with a single currency, it takes out a lot of those. It does create other problems which Europe has faced, which is that some of the less economically strong countries like Greece or Spain have had to go through massive austerity measures, which the people over there have not enjoyed.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. So euro was created as a common currency for all of these countries, but somehow I don't get the feeling that the BRICS countries would allow any creating a new currency that would supersede their own domestic currencies.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I do not know the answer to that. I think that's part of why it's taking so long. I think that Russia would want a petro ruble.
Right.
China would want a petro yuan. Right.
China already actually has two different currencies. Yuan is actually centrally controlled by the Chinese government, but they also have an offshore yuan, which is actually traded and has a floating rate. Now, yuan and offshore yuan, they actually have normally their exchange rates normally coincide pretty closely with each other against US dollar, let's say. But from time to time, you will see differences in the movement of yuan versus offshore yuan, because offshore yuan tends to move more organically because it's traded free trade, but Chinese yuan moves more sharply because it is controlled by the government. So now there are many alternatives and possibilities, but creating a new currency is a fairly difficult thing to do. So I feel like perhaps what they are aiming for is not a full-fledged currency, but more like a currency that is specialized for trade settlements.
That is possible. That is possible. I cannot speak to that because I haven't gone in depth around how it's going to be structured. But what I am following the news around it. So
Right.
I think it's worth exploring how they end up structuring it.
So, speaking of currencies for trade settlements, you were mentioning, Nabil, that there's a common currency used by several African countries
Yes,
when they are trading with
the Central
um,
African franc.
the CFA franc, right?
Yes.
So, what is the CFA franc used for, and what is its like defining characteristic? Would you say?
I the CFA franc is basically a very interesting currency which came about again as a block move recently. It's not a really old thing. It's a relatively the treasury is controlled by the French. So almost all of these countries keep a certain amount of money in France, and these are all countries that are under the French influence.
The
Uh,
zone of influence. So these are countries which trade heavily with France, right?
yes,
So doesn't it benefit them to have this like reserve of CFA franc in France?
it benefits them to maintain what the ecosystem is, but there's strong resentment against France for its colonial past.
Mhm.
And if you go look at what's happening in terms of not just the coups that have happened in Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Gabon, but also if you look at some of what the opposition politicians are saying where the coups haven't happened, there is a very strong sense of that being part of CFA has actually made the lives of the Central African nations worse, not better, particularly through COVID and through the Ukraine war.
So CFA franc is mainly a trading currency, right?
That's what I understand. Again,
But the countries themselves, they have their own currencies.
I cannot speak to this.
Right.
What the if I don't know, I don't know.
Sure.
You know.
But this is okay. Like I'm kind of like um, giving you my understanding of the situation.
Yes.
So, if the CFA franc is a common currency created for common trade and settlements between these countries and France,
Yes.
then what would um, be the difference between CFA franc and a hypothetical new BRICS trade settlement currency? And how would the new BRICS currency be better? Wouldn't it cause resentment in the individual BRICS countries if the BRICS currency uh, forced certain measures on these countries?
So one, we don't know how this will shape out.
Yeah.
Because unlike the CFA, which is a French led, with a lot of pro France governments in place in those countries. So French led pro France, the BRICS countries are definitely doing it different. How they're doing it different, there is a definite focus on like, hey, we want to be able to be an alternate to the IMF and World Bank. This is something that they have stated as much. So be able to provide loans at the level that the IMF provides to developing countries to develop their infrastructure. That's part of what the BRICS has stated. So how they're doing it, I'm not quite sure. This is the state one of the stated aims. That's more what I'm sharing.
Okay, let me actually read out a little bit from Wikipedia since we're discussing it,
Hmm.
and because I think it pertains and it's relevant to a potential BRICS currency,
Hmm.
which pertains to de-dollarization, like we were saying. The CFA franc, franc of the Financial Community of Africa, originally franc of the French colonies of Africa, abbreviation FCFA, is the name of two currencies: the West African CFA franc, used in 8 West African countries, and the Central African CFA franc, used in 6 Central African countries. So it's two different um, African franc currencies used by two different groups of countries in Africa, Western South Africa, uh, which are commonly called CFA franc,
Mhm.
taken together. Although separate, the two CFA franc currencies have always been at parity. Oh, they're effectively interchangeable, so they're 1 to 1. ISO codes are XAF, XOF. December 2019, it was announced that the West African currency will be reformed and replaced with an independent currency called ECO. Um, okay, they're both pegged to the euro, exactly pegged. Okay, and the member countries deposited half of their foreign exchange reserves with the French Treasury. The currency has been criticized for restricting the sovereignty of African member states, effectively putting their monetary policy in the hands of the European Central Bank. Others argue that the CFA helps stabilize the national currencies of franc-zone member countries and greatly facilitates the flow of exports and imports between France and the member countries. Um, okay, now there are no, like, I'm actually kind of like a believer in the idea that there are no magic solutions to global economic problems. So
That's true.
if you're going to form a new BRICS currency for settlements, you're going to have the reserves somewhere. The member countries are going to have to give up something in exchange for getting the benefit of a new international settlement currency and escaping from the dollar.
The catch over here is that the CFA doesn't have the petroleum aspect playing into it in the same way. When you create a commodities based exchange, you can effectively do something much more similar to what the dollar does as compared to the CFA. So is there opportunities? Yes. Do they have a magic wand to solve all of this? I don't know, but I think just bringing that conversation back into the Canadian sphere and
Sure.
and the North American sphere,
Sure.
there is a quite a large amount of movement happening globally around and if you pick up the Western press as well, last year they were barely reporting about it. This year I've seen at least 4 or 5 articles in Bloomberg. A couple of other news organizations I'm starting to see a lot more presence of it, and there is definitely a discussion to be had around what does this mean for a Canadian economy, keeping in mind how heavily we're tied into the dollar. What does that mean for us individually? Keeping also in mind the diaspora that is in Canada, both Russian origin, Chinese origin, and Indian origin,
African origin.
and African origin. And what kind of a role does that mean in terms of, future trade with these countries, future travel with these countries? How does it impact us? How and to me, the acceleration, like there's a status quo piece of it, which was there for, like, the idea was there, but for 20 years there was no movement. The past 5 years have seen a sudden increase in movement in this specific idea. So I see that in the next 5-10 years, there is going to be something happening, whether it's successful or a failure. I don't know that part, but there's going to be something happening on the BRICS side. There's there to do something, and we need to think about what does it mean for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting questions. I don't know. The future, uh, what I do know is that Canada is effectively joined at the hip with the United States
Yes.
economy, for better or worse. The saying goes, if the uh, if the United States sneezes, then Canada catches a cold, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So uh, I don't think that there's any viable way to divorce this relationship. We are going to stay as the US's fraternal twin, or like conjoined twin, joined at the hip.
Yeah, and it's not
biggest
just
trading
it's not just economic, it's also social and
cultural.
and cultural. People get up and go to the US, and it's just like going to your brother's place, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they go there looking for work. It's like, it reminds me how, like, in many developing countries, people from villages come to the cities looking for work.
Yeah.
That I get the same sense of Canadians looking to earn some better income, improve their prospects. They go looking for work in the U.S.
And the Americans come here for their healthcare.
Yeah, true.
So I think this is a great point to end the episode
Yeah.
with a question for our audience. You guys tell us, what do you think is happening with this de-dollarization, and how do you think it impacts our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to hear from you and turn this into a discussion.
Awesome. Take care. Thank you, guys.
Cheers.